in Hebrews, where we have all things greater and better in Christ, tonight we've come to the 7th chapter, the instruction about the priesthood that was interrupted by a great series of exhortations. The writer had introduced the idea of Melchizedek, a character that would appear to be the most minor of figures, appearing in but a few verses in the book of Genesis, at what seems to be a rather otherwise not terribly notable in comparison to other things, incident in the life of Abraham. But having mentioned Melchizedek, who wasn't mentioned in the pages of Holy Writ for 1,000 years before, it's been 1,000 years since his name had come up in the recorded conversations and exhortations of Scripture, the Hebrew writer said, look, I need to pause because some of y'all aren't ready for this. And then he talked about spiritual immaturity and the dangers after that of falling away, but concluded that exhortation saying, but we're convinced of better things concerning you and the things that accompany salvation. And so now, having given that exhortation as to why those who are pressing on in faith can have absolute confidence in God's rock-solid word, we come back to that discussion of the priesthood, of which the writer interrupted himself to go and give that exhortation. So now we're in the greater priesthood of Christ, greater than that which was done in Aaron and in his name by his descendants. And we also see, and this will be in chapter 7, verse 11, where we'll hopefully conclude our studies tonight. We'll see the hinge point of this discussion, the purpose of it. Why do we have so much on the priesthood here? It says, verse 11 of chapter 7, now if perfection was through the Levitical priesthood, for on the basis of it the people received the law, what further need was there for another priest to arise according to the order of Melchizedek, and not designated according to the order of Aaron? So why do we switch from the order of Aaron, which God's people had lived and labored under for a millennia and a half? Why do we switch to the priesthood of Christ under the order of Melchizedek? Well, because if the Levitical priesthood had provided what people needed, the perfection there, which comes with a full cleansing of conscience, comes with a full forgiveness of sins, which comes with a full restoration to God, then why would we need something else? So we need something else when the first doesn't suit, doesn't do the job. And so with that, then, let's have our reading tonight from Hebrews chapter 7, the first 11 verses. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham as he was returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham apportioned 1/10 part of all the spoils, was first of all, by translation of his name, King of Righteousness, and then also King of Salem, which is King of Peace, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, he remains a priest perpetually. Now observe how great this man was, to whom Abraham the patriarch gave 1/10 of the choicest spoils. But, verse 5, and those indeed of the sons of Levi, who received the priest office, have a commandment in the law to collect 1/10 from the people, that is, from their brethren, although they're descended from Abraham. But the one whose genealogy is not traced from them collected 1/10 from Abraham, and blessed the one who had the promises. But without any dispute, the lesser is blessed by the greater, in the case of mortal men who receive tithes, but in this case one receives them, of whom it is witnessed that he lived on. And, so to speak, through Abraham, even Levi, who received tithes paid tithes, for he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. Now, if perfection had come through the Levitical priesthood, for on the basis of it the people received the law, what further need was there for another priest to arise according to the order of Melchizedek, and not be designated according to the order of Aaron? Well, that is, I think, for a lot of folks, pretty obscure. The obscure nature of blessings, who gives blessings and who receives them. When was the last time we received somebody blessing us? When was the last time that we gave blessings in that way? When was the last time we considered this one-time character from the life of Abraham? When was the last time we considered how many generations Levi was after Abraham? When was the last time we thought about priest? When was the last time we thought about someone making for us the way to God and being our intercessor? Well, we think about Christ in some of these things because the whole point of the priesthood is to bring men and women to God and take the things of God to them. But for us now, in the second millennia, beginning almost now the third after Christ, who have such direct access to God through Jesus, it's easy for us to forget how vital a role this was played by men who dedicated their life to it, men who did it on the basis of a proper genealogy, because in the Levitical priesthood, the genealogy was everything. But now here comes Christ, who doesn't do it on a genealogy, but does it on the basis of his own character and worth and dignity, his who he is as a person. It's easy for us to take some of these fundamental and background things almost for granted, because we have Christ who solved everything the priesthood would need for us, so much so that we occasionally think of Christ as priest, but it's not really a big point of emphasis most times and most places. But if I might just give an example of the importance of something that we just consider as automatic, think about what happens when we go and we turn on the tap. We get fresh, clean water. And we get fresh, clean water from the tap nearly every time. So much so that we don't even think about it. Of course, there's water over there. And of course, it's going to be fresh. Of course, it's going to be reasonably tasty. It kind of depends on, what Mulvaney's mixing the water from the various sources today. But most of the time, it's going to be pretty tasty. It certainly will be useful. And it'll just be there ready for us. But if we think about how that gets to us, we think about the infrastructure built by clever men, men who did a lot of math, men who put plans together for big pipes to be laid, strong men who went and moved a lot of dirt, dirty men who go and fix the system whenever it breaks, watchful men who are there to monitor all kinds of gauges and dials and screens, technicians who sample it and send it off for people in labs to test. With all that, work goes on behind the scene. We don't even think about it until something goes wrong. So very much it is with Christ and his priesthood. It's spiritual infrastructure. And how often do we think about infrastructure? Well, when we do, we might get some lovely little documentaries like Modern Marvels and how it's made and various things like that. And sometimes we appreciate those things, and then after that we go on about our day. Well, this is a spiritual infrastructure chapter. The priesthood of Christ, the things on which so many other things depend, the work that Christ was doing, that the people of that day who had a temple, and if they went to the temple, they were gates, and there were fences to keep them out because only the priests could go in. And if they could catch a glimpse inside, there'd be this massive veil that kept even the priests most of the time from going in. And you just trusted that the high priest was going in there for you behind the veil to do the right things. And then he would come out and say, I've done the things, and now here's a blessing. Well, this is a chapter explaining our spiritual infrastructure in the priesthood of Christ. So we start with a history lesson, because this priesthood that Christ has, it's said by an oath and promise of God to be by the order of Melchizedek, who comes up in exactly 3 places in our scriptures, almost exactly 1,000 years apart between each 3. And so in the book of Genesis, there was this king, Genesis 14, that he blessed. He came out from Salem and he blessed Abraham. He said, blessed be Abram, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And then Abraham worshiped with him, and Abraham gave him 1/10 of the spoils. Some men had come down from the north, from around Damascus. They had taken great spoil and many captives from the city of Sodom. Among them was Lot. Abram, because his name hadn't even changed yet. Abram assembled his men, those of his shepherds and those other men that he had, and he went and he chased those guys down because they'd taken Lot. If they hadn't taken Lot, they probably could have got away with it. But Abraham chased them down. Abraham freed Lot. He freed the noblemen, choice men of Sodom. He also gathered up and the things that had been taken as spoils by those of the north. He now had them as spoils for himself. He gave 1/10 to God. He gave the vast majority of the rest of it back to the men of Sodom, saying, you're not going to say, I made, you guys made me rich. I didn't get rich off of your stuff. So he gave the people, and he gave most of the things back. And then he went on about his business. And unless we're doing a complete study of the book of Genesis or a read through the Bible, in a year, we're probably not going to come across this story very often. This story is close enough to the beginning. We probably haven't given up on our read the Bible in a year thing when we get to Genesis 14, because it's so near the beginning. But probably that wasn't even the highlight of the read that we read that day. All right, so here we find from Genesis, some 1,000 years before David, and I bring that time reference up because David will be the next one to mention him in Psalms 110, 1,000 years later, that the Messiah will be a priest after the order of Melchizedek. So we had to have this spiritual history lesson to understand our spiritual infrastructure. Just like, again, if we're talking about our water system today and the glory of being able to just go and turn on the tap and get fresh water, somebody in explaining that will briefly show up a slide of a Roman aqueduct and say, look how far we've come. And so it is that we get this ancient person who is part of the system, and we need to appreciate where it's all come from. So this Melchizedek, it said he was king of Salem. So he lives in exactly the place where Jerusalem is, right? So this Salem is the same as the Salem of Jerusalem. And so here's a priest of God living in the place where the temple will be built 1,000 years in the future. And so this priest shows up. He comes down off that holy mountain and he blesses Abraham as he's returning from that slaughter of those kings, as Abraham had chased them all the way up and past Damascus, and he was on his way home. So Melchizedek had brought him food and drink. They worshiped together. He blessed Abraham. And we read the blessing already from Genesis 14:19. So he is a priest of God. And so we think about Abraham as oftentimes we think of it as the singular servant of God in those days. There's no record of God speaking with other people, unless maybe we think Job is of the same time as Abraham. I think he might have even been a bit before the time of Abraham. That's one of the most likely possibilities. Another possibility is that Job was a righteous man who lived somewhere in the same general area while the children of Israel were down in Egypt in captivity. It's also given as a possibility. But there were some other righteous people out there. There were other people who knew God, right? In the days of Moses, when he fled from Pharaoh, who did Moses go live with? A priest in Midian. And that Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian, is the last person who led the people of Israel in worship to God before Aaron was installed as priest. And so Moses' father-in-law led the people of Israel in the praise to God. So he must have been also a priest of the true God, right? So there were some people of God out there, aside from just Abraham, aside from just the children of Israel in those early days. So here's one of them. Well, what do we know about him? Well, not much. We know the few verses of Genesis 14. We know the oath that is given in his name to the Messiah to be a priest of God in the time of David. And then by the 1,000 years, it's mentioned in the book of Hebrews. So from Genesis to David, there's no mention of him for 1,000 years. He shows up in the book of Psalms, in the oath. He shows up again here as the very head of the order or the type that is Christ. He's such an enigmatic figure, and what's said about him here about being without genealogy, without beginning, without end of days. There's some who think he was an angel. There's some who think he was an incarnation of Christ himself, or some other direct spiritual action or being. I think it's just more likely that he's just a type of Christ who was a faithful man in the days of the patriarchs, as was people like Jethro or Job or a few others. So the important thing here for one of the important parts, verse 2, is that Abraham gave an offering to God, to the priest of God, which was Melchizedek. Abraham gave him tithes. Abraham gave him an offering. And he was this man who Abraham worshiped God through, showing his superiority in these things, as the Hebrew writer will point out. This man was a king, the king of righteousness, the king of peace. So the king of righteousness and the king of peace is superior to Abraham. Now, isn't that what Jesus claims in John 8 that gets him in so much trouble with the Jews? That he's the king of righteousness, he's the king of peace, he's greater than Abraham. And the Jews go, nobody was greater than Abraham. Here was one. And he was the type of which Jesus is the antitype, the fulfillment of the type. So here it is that we have this one back then who God worshiped through, and now we have this one who we worship through, which is Jesus. So this king of righteousness, this king of peace, he was in this other way, verse 3, like Jesus, without father, without money, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God. He remains a priest perpetually. And so it's on that statement that he's a perpetual priest that some think, he was an angel of God, or he was Jesus in the flesh, first time, or something like that. I don't think that's the case. I think that overreads it. But you think about it again with the Levitical priest, genealogy was everything, right? It all depended on genealogy. When they came back from the captivity, there's a little story in Ezra 2, in verses 61 and 2, about some men who came and said, hey, we're priests. And the people in Jerusalem said, okay, let's see your paperwork. Let's see your genealogy. Let's bring out the birth certificates. And they couldn't produce it. And so I don't know if they were trying to pull a fast one and get on the priesthood in the days of confusion after the exile, if they were men who legitimately should have been priests, but by unfortunate accident had lost the ability to prove that. Or if, I don't know, maybe their family gave them stories when they were little that weren't quite true. got a little exaggerated, and they came and that when that story was tested, it fell apart. I don't know, but I know those guys couldn't be priests because they couldn't prove their genealogy. So in the Levitical priesthood, genealogy was everything. How close are you related to Aaron? It's got to be a straight line descent. It didn't matter how many generations it was, but it did matter that it was a straight, direct line. Genealogy was the key. Well, in the book of Genesis, what's said about the genealogy of Melchizedek? Why, nothing. He just shows up as a priest, and then he just disappears as a priest. He fades off into history with the spoils, taking them back to whatever, temple or shrine or altar that he had for God, put to good use, I'm sure, as a priest of God would do. And so he shows up, he gives blessings, he leads the worship, he takes home the tithe, and that's it. So I think he was a real man who lived and died. But according to the record, there is no genealogy that qualifies him for that. There is no record of him living and of him dying. There are several places in the scriptures where there are lists of the high priest. I think there's one in Chronicles where we get to 23 of the high priests counted out. There's one of the Bible dictionaries that I have seen where they list 81 high priests from the time of Aaron to the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. And there's lists. You know who they are. It's traceable. I don't know if it can all be proven and nailed down exactly to be 81 like that Bible dictionary did, but you know that these men served, they lived, they died, they were there by genealogy. The Melchizedek is a priest, no record of his birth, no record of his death, no record of his genealogy, no record of anything. He has no predecessors or ancestors. He has no descendants, except that Christ will come like him, not on the basis of a genealogy to qualify him to be a priest, but on the person that he is that qualifies him to be the priest. So, by the record, he's just there, and he's perpetually a priest. This will literally be true, as we see about Jesus down in verse 25. He ever lives to make intercession for the saints. So with Melchizedek, what's concluded on the basis of a lack of record is actually in Jesus positively affirmed on the reality of his continuing to live. So we see then we have our priestly king, and our priestly king is superior to Abraham. What does that tell all, you Jewish folks, right? Who want to have, but we've got a high priest. No, but we got a better one. Yeah, but we have we've had kings. Well, we got a better one. We've got Christ. Well, now the order, the way of the priesthood we see is superior. It's better in Christ. Verse 4, now observe how great this man was. Well, it's not often we say, in comparison to Abraham, consider how great this fellow was. Normally we say, consider how great Abraham was. In this case, it's consider how great this guy was, compared to Abraham. How much more Christ compared to Abraham. But consider or observe how great this man was, to whom Abraham, the patriarch, gave a tenth of all the spoils. And so Abraham gave him the choicest spoils because he would then go offer those to God. Abraham was giving to God and giving to Melchizedek. So the same with us when we worship through Jesus Christ. Is God jealous? Are we supplanting the Father? No, we're through Jesus going to God. And then, verse 5, so he's better than Abraham. And, well, we're going to see Abraham's the granddaddy of them all, of the Jews and of the sons of Levi and of those of Aaron and all. Those indeed are the sons of Levi who received the priest office, have commandment in the law to collect a tenth from the people, that is, from their brethren, although they are descendants from Abraham. So the Levites, they've got a place, and the law gave them their place, that being of Levi, being of that priestly tribe, they could take a tenth. But before the law was, Melchizedek was there, and he took a tenth, right? And so in Genesis 14, we see the priestly role that's above Abraham long before the law. And ironically, in Genesis 15, Abraham believed God, it was reckoned him as righteousness. The way of faith by which Abraham was saved is also long before the law. So the way of the priesthood of Christ is Genesis 14. The way of salvation by faith is Genesis 15. And these things long predate the law for anyone who wants to be saved by the law. We got the law. We got the law. Well, the Hebrew writer and the Apostle Paul will say, I got the thing 400 years before that, right? Which is a priesthood by a righteous king and salvation by faith. So the Levites certainly under the law could take the tithe. That was their right. But that didn't make them superior to Jesus. The Levitical priests were not superior to Jesus because Jesus came by the way of Melchizedek. And Melchizedek was above their grandpappy Abraham. And so Jesus is above them. There's no comparison in honor and dignity and place. So they take the tithe from their brethren, though they're descended from Abraham. Abraham gave the tithe to somebody outside the family. He gave it to Melchizedek. And so by extension, these guys did too. Verse 6, but the one whose genealogy is not traced from them collected a tenth from Abraham and blessed the one who had the promise. But without any dispute, the lesser is blessed by the greater. Again, that's a thing kind of foreign to us. We don't have formal blessings very often given. If anybody ever would give a blessing, we'd make sure everybody knows. I do this not on the basis of my own dignity, but I do this on the Word of God. I give you the blessings of the Word. It's not of Jay, it's of God. But here's a blessing given on the basis of the personal dignity of the one who's giving it. So when Abraham would give a blessing, when he gives a blessing to Isaac, boy, isn't that something? When Isaac would give the blessing to Jacob, wasn't that something, right? And Esau said, no, I want that something too. And sorry, bud, it's too late. I already gave it to your brother. Jacob, then when he would give the blessing as an old man to Joseph, when Joseph then would bless the children of Israel. So when there's a blessing given, it's the greater one who's blessing the lesser ones. That's why he can give a blessing to them. And so when Melchizedek is giving a blessing to Abraham, where does that put Melchizedek? Above their highest one. If you're a Jew, where does it all start? Who's the fountainhead? Who's the granddaddy? Who's the everything? It's all Abraham, right? The Jews will get mad at Jesus. Again, we'll soon be in John 8 in our Bible studies on Sunday morning. But when Jesus lets them know his position is above Abraham's, they lose it. They totally lose their minds. But he was above Abraham, right? By his person, by being the Lord. He was by this priesthood, by the order of Melchizedek, which Melchizedek was greater than Abraham. So we got a greater priesthood. And again, not ways we normally think of things. Again, spiritual infrastructure, I think is the right way we can think about this. So verse 8, in the case of mortal men who receive tithes, but in the case of one receives them, of whom it's witnessed that he lives on. So we have but one Melchizedek. There's no many Melchizedeks to come. There's only one living on Melchizedek. When it came to the priest of Levi, well, how many were there? Again, in 1 Chronicles 6, verses 3 through 14, there are 23 priests that are named. That Bible dictionary that I mentioned lists 81 from Aaron down to the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. But there's just but one living on, perpetual, like the Son of God priest after Melchizedek. Well, and that's what the Psalm says. After the order of Melchizedek will be Christ. And how does one get that? How does one get to be a priest after the order of Melchizedek? Well, if you're a Mormon, they got a way for you to do it, but they just made it all up, didn't they? And they made it all up pretty recently. But in the scriptures, how does one get to be a priest after the order of Melchizedek? Well, we'll see next week. God gives an oath, and you're in when God gives you the oath, and you're a person worthy of the office. not when you have descended from any particular genealogy. And so it is to speak that even though that through Abraham, even Levi, again, the head of their priesthood, received tithes, paid tithes, for he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. And so nobody after the order of Levi will ever be of a higher place than Melchizedek. That you can't get to the place of Levi, much less his great grandfather Abraham. You just can't be that high. You can't have that position, but Christ can, because he ever lives. He's not there by genealogy. He's there by being the King of peace, by being the King of righteousness, by being the designated one of God, like the priest of old. So we're glad for that, because verse 11, now if perfection was through the Levitical priesthood. And there's the thing. The Levitical priesthood is a central part of the law, right? How do you have the law without the priesthood? Well, the Jews, after the destruction of Jerusalem, it took them a couple hundred years, but they basically rebuilt a new religion they called Judaism without priest and without a temple and without sacrifice, because they didn't have their genealogies anymore. They didn't have their temple anymore and still don't have those things. And so they built what's often been called rabbinical or ethical Judaism. And Judaism today as a religion is based on the teachings of the rabbis and the ethical teachings of the law. Now, in comparison to so many of the world religions, as God-based as it is, it's got a lot in common with Christianity. It's got a lot of things, I think, going for it, as opposed to a lot of pagan religions. But it's not the religion of the law, is it? It's a new thing. It had to morph. In some ways, it's greatly diminished. In some ways, because you didn't have the rituals, they did emphasize the things that were more important, like things of the heart and faithfulness, because you couldn't just go through the rituals. Although over the centuries, Jews have made a lot of rituals, but they don't have the priesthood. And they don't have the sacrifices. So they had to have a different kind of thing. Well, so it is here, but in the God-approved way. Verse 12, when the priesthood changed, there necessity needs to take place a change of the law also. Well, the law was changed. We went from law we went to the gospel, didn't we? We went to a different kind of thing. So a perfection, that cleansing of the conscience, that perfect dealing with sin, that complete way of answering men's real needs, that dealing with sin so that there wasn't this continual remnant of sin that continually plagued the conscience, because the law couldn't make things perfect, as we'll see directly stated. If the Levitical priesthood had done that, we wouldn't need something else. But even in the time of David, just as the Levitical priesthood is about to be restored to its highest place probably in the history of keeping the law, because when they got to the promised land and they dispersed the priests of the land and they worshiped the temple, what happened to the priesthood? Well, it kind of declined, right? It kind of got forgotten about. People didn't give their tithes. When David concentrated things back in Jerusalem, and by his efforts, Solomon was able to build the temple, and we had the regular order of things as David organized the priests into their 24 courses and the like. It's just at that very same time where the priests are being re-elevated and put back to the central place in society that the law intended for them to have, and now they've got this permanent temple at which to exercise all these things. That's when God, through David, says, I'm bringing another priesthood. I'm bringing a different kind of priest. And so even at its best, God says, we're going to go with this for a while, but we got something else coming. So, verse 11 again in that light, if perfection had come through the Levitical priesthood, for on the basis of it the people received the law. And think about it, is Moses, who was a Levite, is Moses read the law so many times? Who was there beside him? Aaron the priest, right? And they would read it and do sacrifices, and they'd sprinkle the book, and they would take at the direction of the priest. They would take the oaths to follow it, and they'd be sprinkled with blood, and there'd be blood spread all over the place with big hyssop branches, right? So they received the law on the basis of this priesthood. If that had really got the job done, what further need was there for another priest to arise according to the order of Melchizedek, and not designated according to the order of Aaron? So if the things of Aaron had got it done, we would have stuck with the things of Aaron. But the things of Aaron didn't get it done. So we brought in a new priest, and we brought in a new law. So going on, the replacement and the effects of that replacement priesthood, that better priesthood of Christ, Lord willing, will be our next study as we look some more at Hebrews chapter 7.